start my third lecture from Ulaanbaatar, where I make a trip. Let me see. And we ended last week's class presentation by considering urbanization trend in pre-modern East Asia. And I thought that you may want to pay enough attention to this piece of information, very interesting information it has. For example, if you pay attention to table 3.3, urbanization in pre-modern East Asia, you can see there population in cities of over 10 million. Over 100,000. Number of percentage of total population. In 1911, 2% of total population lived in big city over 100,000 population. But remember 1910 was Korea occupied by Japanese colonial rule. So after 10 years, 1,000 over. On the other hand, look at, for example, China around 1900, 1910, 3.4%. So roughly double the size of Korea's big city population. China was then much more urbanized, with 3.4% of total population living in a city over 100,000 population. And that increased to 4.9%, 1938. So rapid, we can see here China's rapid urbanization between 1900, 1938. How about Japan? Early 19th century. It says over 6.0% of total population lived in big city, mega city, 100,000 population. So that much Japan's speed of urbanization exceeded China and Korea. Japan was well ahead toward modernization, urbanization trend. So this is very interesting, valuable statistics. So now we learn the economic and social structure of traditional Korea. Exploitive Japanese occupation also laid the groundwork of industry. Exploitive Japanese occupation is, of course, 1910. 1945. This late. So what it says is the following story. While Japan intruded to Korean Peninsula colony, but at the same time, up to that point, Korea was basically farming nation, farmers nation, almost no industrial development. But Japan started to occupy Korea as colony and laid down some groundwork for industry. So industrial experience and increase in labor force began. Expanded educational system. So to some extent, these are merits or these are credits given to Japanese colonialism, even though they were having exploitative administration and power, expand industrial base of Korea, increasing in labor force, expanded education system. However, rural areas became poorer. Why? Because more landlords, less Koreans that owned the farms they worked in. So more landlords, less Koreans that owned the farms they worked in. So their landlords became dominantly previously Korean landlords, now replaced by a lot of Japanese landlords. Areas became poorer. And relatively in the poorer. So you don't. So this type of farming, I defined previously, intensive farming. After 1600, introduction of rice transplanting. Transplanting means rice is grown from wet paddy, wet area, and then replanted into we call transplanting, double cropping of rice, barley in the south. So we call this as double cropping, means in the early summer, they crop rice. In the winter, they harvest barley. So double cropping means rice and barley co-produced in a given year. Okay. So double cropping with keyword to remember rice and barley in the south. Okay, why then? Why then double cropping of rice and barley not in the north? Because northern area of Korea was still very cold. What was not warm enough at that time. Therefore, they could not afford producing, cropping both rice and barley. They could make harvest of rice in the summer and in the winter barley. So double crop was introduced. It did not reach until 16th century in Japan. Please remember, this is very interesting phenomenon. Why do I say this? Used illegally from China. A famous scholar called Moon Ik-jum smuggled, has stolen cotton seed inside put soil inside was not correctly inside Pennsylvania. And okay, Sangwa, are we back? Are we sharing? Sangwa? Okay, sorry. I don't know why it was uh, interrupted, but at any rate, let me continue. So this whole thing century, Korea managed to have cotton seed stolen from China. And it was not until 16th century in Japan, cotton seed was transplanted into Japan. Japan made a very big use of this cotton seed. And Japanese of cotton seed and cotton fiber, cotton textile has become very important, prominent cotton industry, clothing industry. So even though Japan was transplanted very late and only after 16th century, they could get cotton seed. but Japanese manufacturing over the Chinese industry or Korean industry. So that means Japan was very quick in adopting sort of raw material and make it industrialized. Okay, Japan was very quick in that regard. European discovery of America made tobacco and sweet potato crops with gradual irrigation system. So when Europe discovered American continent, tobacco and sweet potato crops were discovered. With gradual irrigation system means tobacco and sweet potato crops need to be planted, grown with adequate water supply. So gradual irrigation system means water supply system could be established so that in American continent, Korea by early 20th century, a complex advanced agricultural technology existed. By the latter part of Yi Dynasty, Korea had acquired a land tenure system. Modern and rural labor force was largely free. Land tenure system means there is a landlord and there are peasants group and peasants group tenure, rent the land and usually give them 50% or 40% of harvest to landlord and then take the rest. So land tenure system was established late Yi Dynasty. Korea under Yi Dynasty had three distinctive classes. The aristocracy or Yangban class, second class commoners, third class lowborn, mainly serfs or slaves. These three distinctive class to the entrance into the high aristocracy. So if you think of similar classes existing in China and Japan, Japan was always most restricted to become aristocracy or what they call in Japan samurai class. And samurai class was most difficult get in. So what this means is a very interesting story. From the low one, in other words, bottom, third, 1/3 of low-born people to get into what we call social promotion. From lower social status to higher social status. The restriction was highest in Japan. Japan was the society most difficult. Korea nextized. China less restricted. Isn't it interesting? China has less restricted social promotion status. In China, in principle, anyone who passed 3-degree examinations were allowed to reach highest bureaucracy. In Korea, only Yangban by birth could take the exams. But mobility between two lower classes. In Japan, there was no chance of becoming samurai class from low-born or commoner status. So this shows very interesting social status, comparative social status among Japan, Korea, and China. Very interesting. There were two social lines. Second, consolidation of private ownership of land, which is bought and sold freely, but highly concentrated in the hands of a few well-to-do families. Difference from China. Probably in China, the landlord group was not that much concentrated. China had a large number of landlord groups, but relatively Korea, very little. The Japanese land survey conducted in the 1910s. So after Japanese occupation of colonial rule, they took land survey first. 40% rented all the cultivated and 20% all the land they tilled. So 40% were basically renters, peasants. 20% owned all the land they tilled. So this is a very interesting story. It shows you kind of a structure. 40% after 1910, 40% of Korean farmers rented all the land, cultivated, 20% owned all the land they tilled. Very important statistics. Were hemmed in by a powerful bureaucracy. What does that mean? Bureaucracy circled around king, and king did not have that much power. Bureaucracy had more power. And that's a very strange system. But Korean kings did not have real power. They were hemmed, circled around by a powerful bureaucracy. That's the Lee dynasty politics structure. A second force limiting Korean absolutism is weak financial position of the government. Only 20% to 30% of harvest. Only 20% to 30% were given to government, central government, or king. So only 20%, 30% made to Seoul. Percentage estimates of GDP at the disposal of government, Korea under only 2%. China under 2%. Tokugawa Japan 25%, dominant. Meiji of Japan 12%. So this shows the power of central government was so weak in Japan, Meiji Japan, central government very powerful because they will give under Meiji Japan, farmers gave 12% of their harvest, but Korea and China only 2%. So there, what does that mean? This means in East Asia, the power of central government could not be great in China or in Korea. Only the central government was powerful under Tokugawa Japan or Meiji Japan. That has significant implication for later East Asian politics, East Asian security problems. You know, the Meiji Japan and Tokugawa Japan ultimately became East Asian powerhouse through their enough budget, their enough spending on military goods out of this tax money. Tax collection, they could spend a lot of money on arms, military spending, so that Meiji Japan could become East Asian power, defeating who? Russian fleet, defeating Qing, China, naval shipyards in late 19th century. So this powerful military power by Meiji Japan was not built overnight. It was built during long period of time through Tokugawa Japan. Japan's central government became very powerful resources center, so that all the farmers at least paid 25% or 12% on the Tokugawa period and Meiji period, respectively, to the central government in the form of tax. So East Asian cities, not commerce center as in Europe, but center of aristocracy and government. For example, this is an example in Europe, for example, Hamburg, very famous large city, was not political center, but commerce center. But for example, in East Asia, Tokyo, Shanghai, Beijing, and Seoul, all these cities, rather than commercial center, they are political center, bureaucratic center. So Tokugawa Japan, numerous military samurai class in the cities, Seoul about 200,000 people until the early 20th century. If you can see table 3, Korea's population about 1/3 of Japan, about 1/13 of China. So, Korea was a very relatively smaller country in terms of population size. A substantial urban population became commercial network. There was a fifth-day periodic markets with peddlers in villages and settled merchants in larger towns with administrative centers. Fifth-day periodic market. This is, I think in Russia too, there was one time, fifth day or 10th day periodic markets where peddlers in villages, settled merchants gathered together in larger towns with administrative centers. In 17th, 18th century, expansion of private commerce came through until 17th century, cloth and grain as substitutes for money. At times, we call these substitutes for money as commodity money. And late 17th and 18th century, copper coinage established, circulating mostly in cities, decline of government handicrafts. So copper coinage established circulation, the role of money, and therefore government handicrafts declined. Foreign trade was a government monopoly. Embassies were sent by Korea to China and received by Korea from Japan. So foreign trade was strictly government monopoly, did not allow private monopoly or private company. Commerce in Korea more developed in 18th century, 19th century, but far behind comparative development in China and Japan. So far behind is the key word. Both China and Japan banking system for transferring funds to other nations, but Korea did not have such system. Education in Korea, as in China, major road to government office for many yangbans, upper class residents. In 18th century, 17% to 30% of landlord families belong to yangbans. This is an interesting story. Okay, so teaching in classical Chinese, a language of written communication, in 1921, after 10 years of the Japanese occupation, over 500,000 Korean students in school with nearly 30,000 in traditional schools. In traditional schools, okay, so in traditional schools, Okay. So this is an interesting statistics that I contributed in compiling. You see, we can see throughout colonial period, Japan occupied Korea from 1910. You know, in many development economies, we pay attention to most important social indicator is primary school enrollment ratio. Okay. Primary school enrollment ratio is, okay, let's see. Primary school enrollment ratio is how many percentage of children aged So this is the primary school enrollment ratio, usually 100%, 100 times. So when you have here, you see 1911, this blue dot is 10%. Then means if there were 100 students, children aged 6 to 12 years old, only 10%, only 10 students were enrolled in primary school. Okay, that's what we call primary school enrollment ratio. Okay, very important statistic. You know, the development economies pay a lot of attention to this statistic. How many children aged 6 to 12 years old are actually in school, enrolled in peasant school or a village school or modern primary school? According to, I think this was compiled Japanese scholar named Kimura, whom I met many years ago. According to his statistic, less than 10% of Korean students aged 6 to 12 actually went to village primary school. But remember, Japan tried to integrate Korean Peninsula with mainland Japan. We call in Korea 내선 일체. 내 means interior. That's mainland Japan. 선 means Chosen, Korea. So Japan, Korea, one body. Under that kind of slogan, Japan tried to integrate Korea with the hope, with wishful thinking that Korea is permanently annexed to Japan. In other words, to permanently rule Korean Peninsula, they had to change Korea's education system. They had to make Korean students Japanese students. They had to make Koreans into Japanese education system. So you see here, this primary school enrollment ratio within less than 10 years jumped from 10% to 20%. And ultimately, by 1942, when Japanese colonial rule is ending, this primary school enrollment ratio jumped about 50%. What does that mean? Out of 100 aged children, aged 6 to 12 years old, 50 students, 50% of students were enrolled in primary school. This is miracle-like uprising, upgrading of primary school enrollment rate. And we call this first educational explosion under Japanese colonial rule. Second educational jump was made under 1953 after Korean War under Lee government. Look at this. Primary school enrollment ratio in blue dotted line, started off around 60%, but by 1975, 100% over. What does that mean? There was a second educational explosion. So here is my thesis. My thesis: when Korea, after 1962, made a miracle-like economic performance, rapid growth, my proposition to you and to other scholars is that Korea benefited from two explosive education. First system in Japanese, they became later Korean development manager class. They became manager class of the Korean society, Korean factories, Korean offices. Those beneficiaries during 1950s, they became main force workers, factory workers, office workers, engineers, technicians. Remember, this first group, beneficiary of 1920 first primary education expansion, was basically Japanese trained, Japanese system. So Japanese education system beneficiaries. On the other hand, this 1950s, mostly American education system. mass American education system beneficiary became, so this two-tier system, what I define two-tier system, first group, Japanese educated, Japanese trained workforce who became manager class in later Korea's development. Together with American trained, American tradition, American education system beneficiaries. These two groups worked together in harmony and made Korea's economic miracle successful. That's my proposition. That's what I used to refer to whenever I had held a seminar in Korea, World Bank or IMF, how Korea could develop so fast based on these two-tier education system development. So to continue, Korea was blessed with an excellent phonetic alphabet Hangul invented by Yi Dynasty King Sejong in the 15th century. 1930s, literacy surveys indicate less than 20% of rural families were without a member literate in modern Hangul. 80% literate. Extreme isolation of the nation compared to China and Japan. 16th, 17th century, much of South and Southeast Asia under direct or indirect colonial rule. China, after the first Opium War in 1830, missionaries and foreign missions. So China's port opening was made through Opium War. It was a forced opening. The arrival of Commodore Perry's Black Ship in Japan made later Japan opened, 1954. Remember, Korea, with 1/3 of Japan's population, resisted French American incursion, but ultimately made a deal with the Gangwon Island and so roughly there is a 10-year difference between China's opening, Japan's opening, and Korea's opening. But according to Mason et al., this textbook authors, they called Korea's opening was dangerously late. At that time, during 19th century, this 10-year difference made a big difference. Remember, Opium War and Commodore Perry's Black Ship arrival. Only 10 year difference, 15-year difference. It's only 20, but the whole East Asia history different. Korea finally opened up to the West in 1996. Dangerous, dangerous ignorant transformation according to the West, too weak. Okay, for 34 more years, Korea managed a semblance of independent government. In 1905, Korea's Russia-Japan War, formality of annexation in 1910 followed, industrialization and modernization through the filter of Japanese experience, colonial rule was very direct, profound, and traumatic in its impacts. Prior to that, probably there was Japan, naval defeated Qing naval in probably I think this should be 1903. We will see this. So an absolute hegemony power. In this stage. Therefore, formally annexation of Korean Peninsula followed. This story is very fascinating. Okay. By the 19th century, serfdom was slavery nearly disappeared. Contractual relation between landlord and tenants, non-master relation, less. In the area of mass education, Korea surpassed China and Japan by the phonetic alphabet invention as a single unified nation. That's credit given to Korea. So the impact of Japanese colonialism after 1910, 1945, Japan surrendered to the Allied forces. Japanese rule was brief but profound and impact. Vigorous Korean military and political resistance followed, but Japanese suppression to wipe out Korea's national and cultural identity continued too strong. Japanese names and languages were forced to be used. Antipathy towards the Japanese deep-rooted. This is still Korea-Japan's relation currently is very sour, deep-rooted. Because of this traditional tension, friction. For Korea's cannot be relieved disaster. Korean standard of living declined in both absolute and relative terms during the colonial rule, but it laid the key foundations for Korea's later modern economic growth. So here are some footage. And look at this under the colonial of Japanese government. Joseon students were forced to make rice bags. So that much stress was felt on students to make rice bags rather than doing study. Means the south gate of the city, Seoul City, left-hand side. But by 1930s, middle of Japanese colonial rule, very modern city, became very much village-like city. Within 40 years, transformed to modern city. Looks like almost Japanese modern city. The first Western hotel in Korea, the Joseon Hotel, built in 1914. Supung Dam, which is located near Amrok River, Yalu River, way to the border of North Korea and Russia, was constructed by Japanese between 1937 and 1943. So the industrial power of Japan was formidable during 1937 because they could build kind of water dam, storage dam, electric water supply system they could build. Okay, this is the impact of Japanese colonialism. You can see from 1910, almost all the products, agriculture, industry, fishery, and forestry all moved up, jumped up, production. And if we think green line is industry portion kept rising from less than 10% to roughly 45% by 1940. So Korea's industrialization was made during the Japanese colonial period. Railway, health subscribers, all these are impact of Japanese colonialism. And economic growth after 1910. During Japanese colonial period, Japanese government's general economic growth was substantial between 1910 to 1945. Manufacturing growth over 10% a year. Annual growth 2% to 1.6%. Gross material product and GNP growth rate about 4% a year. Population growth 1.6% a year. Per capita commodity growth is 2%. Similar rate in Japan, one of the then world's fastest growing nations at the time. So under colonial rule, Korean government, Korean economy made a fast growth as fast as Japanese economy. Japanese intended to serve the economic needs of Japan, not those of Korea, of course. In 1940, 94% of authorized manufacturing capital in Korea was owned by Japanese. So key sectors such as metals, chemicals, gas, and electrical appliances were Japanese. Korean firms were much smaller and financially weaker. 1,600 Korean technicians in 1944. Only 19% of all, 81% Korean population, Korean percentage among 1,600 technicians were very relatively small, like 20% to 80% figure. But still, those technicians, remember these technicians, had a valuable experience in engineering and technology. And they laid the groundwork after 1945, Korea's development. These people, 1,600 Korean technicians, and 19% of all Koreans, they made the foundation for Korea's well-trained job, on-the-job training, and engineer and education system, and so forth, for later development. By 1947, the number of manufacturing construction establishments fell from 10,065 to 4,500 because Japan left Korean Peninsula. Employment declined 41%. Manufacturing output was only 15% of 1939. So Japanese departure from Korean Peninsula had a very devastating effect on Korea's economy around 1947. Then followed division of Korean Peninsula and Korean War, and loss of Japanese markets and people. Little of importance was left over from Japanese colonial, but ownership and physical capital misleading. Table 3.5, considerable expansion in Korean factory labor force from 12,000 in 1912 to 300,000 in 1940. From 23.5 million population, but Korea began its independence with a substantial cadre of experienced workers. Large immigration into Japan, 1.9, 2.0 million Koreans in Japan by 1945, and over 1 million in Manchuria, Japanese held territory, and rapid urbanization during the colonial period. Koreans in Japan received higher wages, and residents in cities, modern sector employed, are the stock of human capital for post-independence economic development. Educational base of traditional Korea was much stronger than many other pre-modern societies. Japanese expanded primary level education to integrate Korea into the Japanese empire. as I said earlier. The number of common schools increased from 306 in 1911 to 715, more than doubled in 1921, and to 2,600 by 1937. So explosive education. One common school for each of 2493 million townships. So very rapid primary school education expansion system was adopted. 900,000 pupils by 1937 and over 1 million people by 1945. In 1921, 57,000 pupils in common school with still 29,000 enrolled in traditional schools, a total nearly half of 1937 level. So the educational pyramid narrowed but not disappeared. Tens of thousands in high schools, thousands more in universities in Korea or Japan, but with severe discrimination against Korean. Institutional development follows the finances of government, a modern monetary system, a railroad system between Seoul and Busan to Manchuria and Europe, a high-quality extension service in the rural areas to supply Japan's demand for inexpensive rice, but Korea's monetary banking system reverted to 1910 system and general deforestation followed. But something of value was retained. The rural extension system, the Bank of Korea from Old Bank of Chosun, and other special banks for agriculture and industry, academic excellence in Seoul National University, and private universities of Yonsei and Korea University continue to exist. Korea as a source of cheap rice, as a place for Japan's surplus population, land survey and take over all land in the public domain. Steady conversion from farmer-owned and tilled land to landlord-owned and tenant-tilled land. Farm families who owned no land increased from 38% to 55%. About 17% of land farmed by tenants was owned by Japanese landlords. No income distribution data, but a large surplus of rural poor existed. In 1937, half of South Korean farm families farmed less than half of a hectare of land. Much of that land was owned by landlords. Depressing effect on urban wages, 1910 through 1944, money wages increased by 262%, but lagged behind WPI, wholesale price index. So what does that mean? When money wage increased 262%, inflation rate exceeds 262%, greater than 262%, 315%, then real wage declines, right? Despite a steady rise in average per capita national product, the income of half or more of the population was declining in absolute terms. So land reform and unintended side effect of the Korean War began to appear. rising from output with increasing tenancy. The land reform was done in Korea. Exporter of rice and other agricultural products. From 19 to about 60% or more of Korean exports. From 1925 to 1935, 40% of Korea's total rice crop was exported to Japan. So this means very important implication. Korea could export 40% of rice to Japan, not because Korea had plenty of rice, but because rice price was relatively very high. So to feed Korean population, they had to export 40% of Korea's total rice crop to Japan. And in exchange, they import a lot more crops, barley, wheat and other crops, so that they can feed Korean people. In other words, this Korea's rice export was not volunteer or autonomous export. It was kind of, unfortunately, export and all other wheat and so forth. Korea's foreign trade sector was built on a foundation of inequality that collapsed when land was redistributed and farmers started consuming most of their own rice instead of giving it to the landlords, who then sold it to Japan. So this is urbanization during the colonial period. Urbanization during the colonial period. Total population and persons urban area increased over 10,000, 100,000 people living. It increased from 2.6% 1910, 9.8% by 1941. So this is a very important statistics, urbanization in Korea during the colonial period. Net value of commodity product. What this means, when you get the output product, you get rid of, you deduct self-consumption, own farm consumption, or your own consumption. We call that as a net value of commodity product. Total sales minus self-consumption. Then that increased at an annual rate. You can see here. Mining and manufacturing. And average annual growth rate reaching almost 9.7%. Agriculture, forestry, and fishery relatively slower growth rate, 2.3%. This 9.7% annual growth rate is a miracle-like growth rate in mining and manufacturing during colonial period. Okay. Owner-tenant distribution before 1945, owners was 22%, but by 1937, owner group declined. Tenants group 38%, increased to 55.1%. Trade and income distribution, colonial period left Korea unstable, political impact of Japanese rule, no management experience in running the country, discredited system of Lee dynasty, and autocratic rule of the hated Japanese left over. Country's division that followed was devastating. Most of the mines and half of production output stayed in the north. Destruction of many lives and resources, political instability after 1945 until military coup of 1961. Heritage of Japanese colonialism, Koreans deprived of opportunity to develop effective political institutions of their own. So unmitigated disaster, the economy split into two. South having 2/3 of population, one half of arable land, 2/3 of the paddy acreage. North, most of mines and about one half of all manufacturing output and most of electricity. Considerable disruption, but poor workers and technicians. South Korea had to develop manufacturing exports, while North Korea kept relying on mineral exports. So this is what we call, economists call, nature's curse. In other words, if you are having some energy or some resource, rich resources, like Saudi Arabia, having rich reserve oil, then that limits the country's development because because of that nature's harvest, nature's blessing, then much other areas are not developed. So in this case, Korea did not have that much resources, therefore did not have nature's curse. And South Korea had to develop manufacturing exports, while North Korea kept relying on mineral exports. So North Korea's limitation was self-limited. They can only export mineral exports, that's it. But South Korea had to work hard in manufacturing exports to be able to sell overseas market. So that's the starkation. That's the difference between North Korea and South Korea starting point. Military budget, 5% of GDP in South, 15 to 20% of GDP in North. Therefore, confrontation and hostility continue to exist, even by now, on surrounding nuclear issue, North Korea's nuclear issue. The gap, military gap, the gap between South Korea and North Korea in terms of living standard is estimated roughly 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 per capita income wise. South Korea's income, per capita income is about 20 times or 30 times higher than North Korea's income per capita. So comparison of land and population between South and North Korea at the time of partition, you can take a look at these statistics. An interesting comparison can be made. And the net commodity product in South and North Korea, all these supplementary statistics are supplementing our discussion. on today's session. So please pay attention to these. This is a scene of Seoul City after liberation in 1949. Very still, very much village-like picture. This is President Park standing in front of POSCO inauguration, and he staged the so-called new village movement to cultivate, to modernize villages, farmers. This is another POSCO facility, industrializing symbol. And conclusion is the Korean historical heritage has unified and homogeneous population. Class structure had begun to erode during the latter part of Yi Dynasty and undermined by the Japanese colonial rule and by independence, land reform, and the Korean War. So Korea's population and agricultural output steady increase with self-support. So Confucianism, deep sense of education, phonetic alphabets, primary school expansion are the key feature of Korea's modernization. Most serious negative features, isolation of Korea from international arena and ruling their own country. Okay, so we close chapter 3 just by this time, and I'd like to listen to your questions and comments on chapter 3. Okay. Okay. If there are no significant questions, I hope. Okay, Sangwa, are you ready? Okay, I will send you revised edition, revised PowerPoint in a minute. Okay, thank you for all of your attention.